Something big is happening right now inside of the Russian army, and Moscow is desperate to hide it. When you look past the missiles, and then you will see the real fight, and it is inside of the Russian officer corps. Ever more, paper obedience is rising, while real execution is decaying. And on February 10th, the mask slipped. Roskomnadzor, the Russian censor agency, began to throttle Telegram, a messaging app, and this made it impossible for the colonels on the front to communicate. But perhaps this is not so much about the colonels on the front communicating. This was not so much about censoring people in Russia. But how about if this was to make sure that the colonels cannot conspire against the Kremlin? In fact, consider if this was all just a show. This was all being done just to make sure that nobody could turn against the state. The friction that we see today is the spark before the entire operational engine begins to seize. Every major Russian collapse in history began with this exact pattern of internal sabotage. Moscow is gambling that they can break the West before their own officers turn the guns around. These are the points in history where many things can happen very quickly. And right now, inside of Moscow, it looks like something big is about to blow. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a Kiev Post special correspondent and a national security advisor. Now, we've already seen full well that discipline in the Russian army is at best wanting. But what we see now transcends mere disorganization or confusion or even anarchy. That could have been any day in the Russian army in the past 200 years. What we're seeing now is different. What we are seeing is that the military elites understand that perhaps their greatest enemy isn't on the other side of the front line, but perhaps the real enemy is behind them, those who say they have their back. Yet, incredibly, as we have seen during these peace talks in Geneva, some still incredibly believe that Russia is winning. So help us get the truth to the world of what's really happening inside Russia and what's really happening inside of Ukraine. Subscribe to this channel, like and share this video, hype this video, and consider becoming a channel member today. So the Kremlin is likely aware that there are some significant problems. And when confidence dies, a strongman regime pivots to containment, and Moscow fears internal coordination more than battlefield inefficiency. And that is why Ukraine is only the battlefield. The target for Moscow is different. The target is control. But consider this. If the Russians are in fact throttling Telegram to prevent their own soldiers from turning against them, well, what does that say about the state of the Russian army as a whole? Does it surprise you that today the Russians are not making any gains inside Ukraine and are being pushed back? Does it surprise you that we see so many totally irrational decisions on the battlefield? Or is that all because the officers on the front aren't sure what their own future is? So what happens in this battle today or tomorrow is not something that keeps them up at nights. But the Kremlin is worried about the military being able to communicate. So really, why could that be? Now, consider who could pose an existential threat to the Kremlin. It's realistically not Ukraine that will invade Moscow sometime soon. It's most likely not going to be NATO either. However, just 2 years ago, we saw a group of Russian troops under Wagner, under Prigozhin, that did seek to invade Moscow, and they were surprisingly successful. They made a lot of territory, they went very far before they were slowed down. And since then, we've seen that the Russian National Guard, headed by Viktor Zolotov, a close friend of Vladimir Putin, is now given more power than ever. Incredibly, he's been given tanks in Moscow. Tanks in Moscow are not there to fight protesters. You have tanks to fight armored divisions. So where would that armored division come from, if not from Ukraine, nor NATO? That armored division would come from Russia. So these events, when we look at all these things together, show something important. Moscow is taking all of the steps now to make sure there is not another Prigozhin moment, that there will not be another Wagner uprising. Now, many have not picked up on this. The Guardian described rare vitriolic criticism from soldiers and pro-war bloggers. And when pro-war voices complain about coordination friction, that reaches a new level. Now, Medusa reported that military bloggers in Russia were saying that Telegram is important because the formal channels that the Russian military uses are slower and they're dangerous. Officer competence degrades because obedience is the only metric for promotion. But there's something else. Russia right now, not being able to use Telegram means the soldiers have to turn back to antiquated radios that the Ukrainians can intercept. So how can the Russians hope to get ahead if their messages are being intercepted? So why would Moscow take such a radical step as making it impossible for them to communicate. Now, Vladimir Putin is a dictator. He only has one priority. There's only one thing that Vladimir Putin cares about, and that is Vladimir Putin. And that is how he became a dictator, because he doesn't care what anyone else wants or thinks. But today, he knows his regime is being challenged. So if this means that some thousands of Russian soldiers will die, but it might protect his regime, that for him is not a difficult decision. That is very clearly a very good decision. But there's a lot of reasons today that the Russian soldiers would probably happily turn against the Russian state. Right now, they're being sent into meaningless meat assaults that in no way will change the outcome of the war. They're being robbed by their own officers. We see routinely that they are trying to desert and then are beaten to death by their officers. So, how could they ever wish to stay with that team? But for that matter, their officers lie about the well being of the soldiers as well. They say the soldiers are fine, that they're making lots of progress. But these sanitized reports, they create repeat errors, and repeat errors destroy officer confidence. Delayed corrections raise casualties because the system learns too late. Bad numbers survive because nobody is rewarded for correcting them. But it's not just the enlisted men. The officers face the same. Consider the officers today who no longer believe the promises. They understand that the failures will continue returning. And this is the silent mutiny. Promotion rewards obedience, and signals are more important than tactical initiative. Risk aversion spreads, and adaptation slows under this pressure. But the officers choose the safest interpretation of orders in order to avoid personal risk. And when initiative is punished, commanders wait for permission. Fear becomes operational behavior, and initiative turns into delay. Today, we're seeing that there's selective compliance with a lot of different orders that come from Moscow, and most of the officers are undoubtedly lying in what they tell their superiors. But there's something else that happens. We see that there's plenty of times where there's a group of Russian soldiers die, their officers aren't found with them. What are they doing there by themselves, alone? It's because their officers understand there's nothing to gain in this. They're not going to heroically die for something that makes no difference. And today, they realize that things are not looking good. War punishes slow systems through logistics. Messaging disruption means convoys miss routes, and it's going to be harder to coordinate. But there's something else that's very important. Russia today is actually losing territory inside Ukraine. In fact, over 200 square kilometers, 78 square miles, just in the past few days. And also, parts of Russia remain under Ukrainian occupation. And you can make it worse for the Russians. Check out the first pinned comment below, and right below the question of the day that I hope you'll answer, be sure to check out this video that's very important about what's happening in Russia and how this all fits together. But right below that, see how you can donate for the Ukraine soldiers to get what they need to fight and to win. A very generous donor is matching all of our donations right now. Thank you. So look what Moscow is doing in the talks right now in Geneva. We saw that these talks in Switzerland were supposed to end the war, but according to all of the different reports that have come out, there were very low expectations that anything would happen. In fact, there's massive gaps between the Ukrainian and the Russian position, something that's not changed despite a full year of negotiations. And because of this, we can expect that nothing will happen. But amazingly enough, there are some people who believe that it's the Ukrainians that need to be pressured, because Russia inevitably is going to win. Now, President Zelensky has said that the United States has sent a June 2026 deadline to reach a deal. Now, Moscow benefits if Washington argues with Kiev, because unity is a battlefield resource. Moscow pairs escalation with a sales pitch, pressure on the ground, and incentives in the room. Restoring trust in your generals is a little bit more difficult, and they know they probably can't achieve that. Russia knows that it cannot achieve a victory on the battlefield. In fact, it is estimated just to take the rest of Donbass, which Ukraine is being pressured to give away right now, it would take over 1 million more Russian soldiers killed or injured. It could take years more. Incredibly, part of the Donetsk, which they're trying to take now, I've been to many times. In fact, I was there delivering drones just a couple of months ago. And what you realize there is the people certainly don't want to be part of Russia. But the most incredible part is that Russia understands that. Russia also understands that it cannot force them into Russia because it cannot take the territory. Now, President Zelensky has said that Russia pitched the United States a $12 trillion economic framework tied to the peace process. It's called the Dmitriev Package, named for Kirill Dmitriev, the head Russian negotiator. The Kiev Post reports that the Russians appear to be interested in making this deal, and they, in fact, so much as confirmed it officially on February 13th. What's so interesting about this is that the Russians are offering a $12 trillion plan. It's sort of incredible when you consider the size of the Russian economy. Russia's entire economy, if you look at it by GDP, it's 5.5 times smaller than $12 trillion. The federal scale makes it even more incredible. It's about 23 times more than Russia's entire federal budget. If you look at it in terms of the security of Russia, it's 58 times more than Russia's combined defense and security spending. So, how could Russia possibly come up with $12 trillion? The fact is, it can't. It is lying. Russia habitually lies about things, as it's lying about this. Here's the reality of Russia today: Moscow's Caribbean footprint has completely imploded. Cuba is begging Russia to fix its Cold War era air defenses, such as the S 75 and S 125s. These came out in about 1957, and the other came out around 1961. Russia cannot even keep up with its legacy exports. After the U.S. capture of Maduro in January 2026 and the fuel blockade, Russia lost its regional platform, and Russia stopped being able to project strength into the Caribbean. Russia is evacuating its own tourists from Cuba because it's not sure it will have enough jet fuel in the future to get them home. If it cannot refuel its own civilian aircraft, it certainly cannot sustain a long term war, nor power projection in a foreign region. The Russian defense industry now looks like a graveyard to everyone who's watching. The game for the Kremlin is clearly nearing its end. But within Russia, you can tell that they're not only broke, but afraid. Consider the $207 billion spent on security. It shows that they expect domestic friction. So, what is Russia's strategy at this point? How does it think that it can win? Today, Moscow is gambling that it can break the West before officers break the regime. Disillusionment is turning into operational failure. One side of this equation is going to snap before the summer, and it's not clear which side it will be, but both sides cannot make it to the end. For Russia today to fight this war is becoming increasingly impossible, and not only because Russia cannot afford it economically, not because Russia militarily cannot do this, but because Russia today is a country that's desperate to keep the show on the road. Right now, the Putin regime is becoming destabilized. How else can you explain a decision so rash as taking away the communication of your frontline soldiers? Make sure that your officers cannot communicate. Is it really about you're worried that people will read what's happening on CNN? Or is it because you're more worried that within your own ranks, they could be working against you? And that's where things turn interesting. For Vladimir Putin today, he's got his shoulder to the wall. There's not much he can do from here. He knows that this war is one that he cannot win. Russia, within its own country, is a desperate situation. The cost every month they're going up for the average person. The government's costs continue to rise. In fact, just in January, the government spent more money in deficit than it had anticipated for all of 2026. So, with those sorts of numbers, I do think that Russia is going to be able to afford an ongoing war. Isn't it much cheaper to promise something, a $12 trillion fairy tale, and hope that some fool will believe it, and hope that he then will pressure the Ukrainians? Because that is exactly what appears is happening. However, for Russia, that doesn't mean that things are just going to be fine, because there's something else going on. They have an officer corps that's angry. Behind that officer corps are a lot of soldiers who don't support their government. Check out this video and you'll see why. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.